Most of us are taught that closure is necessary for healing, that if we don't say everything, don't clarify right and wrong, don't close things properly, we will remain stuck forever. But the lived experience of many empaths tells a different story. There is a stage in the recovery journey when closure no longer brings freedom, it only pulls you back into the old system. And there comes a moment when you no longer need closure, not because you understand everything, but because the question itself has died. In Carl Jung's depth psychology, there is a crucial boundary between two processes. One is ego stability that comes from the outside, and the other is inner integration that arises from within. The narcissist survives through the first process. The mature empath moves into the second. And closure sits precisely at that boundary. For the narcissist, closure is not merely the end of a relationship. It is a way to retain control over the narrative. It is how they ensure that their self-image, the persona, is not left suspended in an uncontrollable void. Without closure, they no longer know who they are in that story. And when identity is threatened, the shadow begins to emerge. By contrast, the empath initially also longs for closure, not to control, but to understand, not to win, but to feel safe. Yet if the healing journey unfolds in the right direction, there comes a day when you realize you no longer need the other person to say anything more to validate your experience. Your memory is clear enough, your body already knows, and your nervous system is no longer anchored to them in order to find stability. This video is not about demanding closure, nor is it about rejecting closure as a tactic. We are going deeper than that. We are exploring the psychological reasons why the narcissist needs closure in order to function, and why the empath, once truly mature, no longer does. Not because they are stronger in a confrontational sense, but because they have stepped out of the same level of questioning altogether. If you have ever wondered why your silence sends the other person into panic, if you have noticed that you no longer feel the urge to explain, even though you once desperately wanted to be understood, and if you are entering a strange state that is neither victory nor resentment, but a quiet calm that is hard to name, then this video is for you. Because sometimes freedom does not arrive with an answer. It arrives when the question itself no longer exists. Part 1. What closure really is and why most people misunderstand it. Before talking about narcissists or empaths, we need to do something essential. Dismantle the false definition of closure. Because if you still think closure is simply a final conversation, an apology, or a symbolic handshake that neatly ends everything, you will never understand why some people cannot live without it, while others move on peacefully without needing it at all. In psychological reality, closure is not an action. It is a function, more precisely, a mechanism of emotional regulation. When a relationship ends, the human nervous system enters a state of instability. Some people can regulate that state from within, others cannot. Closure appears exactly at this point of difference. For many people, especially empaths, in the early stages of recovery, closure functions like a psychological brace. It clarifies what happened, helps calm the nervous system, and gives pain a shape, a cause, a story to hold onto. At this level, closure is not wrong. It helps the body feel safe again. The problem is that many people stop here and mistake the brace for the spine. In Carl Jung's depth psychology, there is a crucial distinction between ego stability and inner integration. Ego stability often requires external elements, explanations, validation, a story with a clear beginning and end. Inner integration is different. It occurs when a person can tolerate emptiness, endure not knowing, and no longer needs the external world to regulate the nervous system on their behalf. At its core, closure is a form of externally sourced ego stability. It prevents the ego from remaining suspended in an unfinished state. It allows a person to tell themselves, This has been dealt with. The critical question, however, is who needs this form of stability the most? Narcissists do not need closure because they love more. They need closure because they lack the capacity to close emotional loops internally. Their entire psychological structure depends on emotions being regulated from the outside. When a relationship ends without closure, that system immediately loses balance, not because a person is lost, but because a function is. Here is a subtle but essential point. For a narcissist, people are not just people. They are roles, mirrors, emotional anchors. When that role disappears without a closing ritual, the narcissist does not know where to place themselves in the new reality. Their identity becomes suspended between two states, no longer reflected, yet not fully framed or sealed. This is why narcissists become obsessed with closure. They need a final moment to finalize your role, redefine themselves within the story, complete the narrative so the persona does not collapse. For them, closure is not healing. It is control over the story. Empaths, by contrast, usually approach closure from a different level. They seek closure to understand, to know where they went wrong, to distinguish what was real from what was false. But if the healing journey unfolds in the right direction, a crucial moment arrives. The empath begins to realize that not every question requires an answer from another person. And this is what many people fail to notice. Closure does not disappear. It changes location. It moves from the outside to the inside. Instead of needing the other person to say, "I'm sorry," your body begins to recognize, "That hurt me." Instead of needing their acknowledgement, you begin to trust your own memory and lived experience. At that point, closure is no longer a dialogue. It becomes an inner state. Most post-breakup conflict between narcissists and empaths is not about feelings. It is about a mismatch in regulatory levels. The narcissist needs closure to keep the old system functioning. The empath, having shifted to internal regulation, is no longer operating at the same level of need. This mismatch creates panic on one side and quiet on the other. When you understand this, many familiar behaviors begin to look different. The circular messages, the questions that go nowhere, the repeated revisiting of the past. None of this happens because they haven't let go. It happens because they cannot close the loop without your participation. Part 2. Why empaths once needed closure, and why that was normal. There is a dangerous misunderstanding that empaths often impose on themselves. The belief that having once longed for closure is a sign of weakness, dependency, or emotional immaturity. But when you look more closely at the empath's psychological developmental journey, you see the opposite. Needing closure was not a flaw, it was a necessary stage. Empaths seek closure not because they want to control the narrative, but because they cannot live in prolonged emotional chaos. When a relationship collapses in a way that is ambiguous, contradictory, and inconsistent, the empath is the one who remains stuck the longest, not because they are clinging, but because they are capable of sensing too many dimensions at once. Empaths need understanding so their inner system can stop turning against itself. They need to piece memories back together to know what was real, what was imagined, and where boundaries were blurred or erased. At this stage, closure does not take the form of a final conversation. It takes the form of an attempt to restore order to a world that has just been overturned. Many empaths grew up in environments where emotions were never clearly named. They learned to read the room, anticipate others' needs, and regulate themselves in order to maintain harmony. So when a relationship ends in ambiguity, their bodies react intensely, not because they need the other person, but because uncertainty activates a primitive sense of unsafety. At this stage, empaths are not seeking closure to end things with the other person. They are seeking closure to end things with themselves, to end the self-blaming loop of questions. Did I do something wrong? Did I misunderstand? If I had said it differently, would things have changed? Closure, at this stage, is a way for the empath to re-establish inner moral order. They want to know what was right, what was wrong, what part was theirs to take responsibility for, and what should never have been theirs to carry. This is not control. It is the search for inner fairness. But precisely because closure plays this role, it is only useful for a limited period of time. It is a bridge, not a home. The problem begins when the empath tries to stay on that bridge too long, waiting for the other person to provide more information, more explanations. One final missing piece, when in reality, there is no final piece. And then a transition occurs, usually very quietly. It is not the moment when the empath suddenly understands everything. It is the moment they realize that every attempt to find more answers leaves the body more exhausted. Every effort to put everything in the right place tightens the nervous system further. And for the first time, the empath asks a different question. Does needing to understand more actually make me feel safer? This is the point at which closure begins to lose its function. Not because the empath has become strong enough to reject it, but because it no longer addresses the real problem. The problem is no longer a lack of information. The problem is a nervous system overloaded by trying to make sense of a system that never operated according to healthy logic. At this stage, the empath begins to shift from understanding in order to feel safe to sensing in order to protect oneself. They no longer need to know more about what happened. They need to know what must not be repeated. And this shift marks a crucial step in maturity. The empath no longer places their safety in someone else's hands. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the ego stops seeking order externally and begins forming its own inner order, no longer relying on validation, no longer relying on explanations, but grounded in lived experience that has been integrated. So if you once needed closure, that says nothing negative about you. It simply shows that you were exactly where you needed to be at that time. And if today you are beginning to feel that seeking closure no longer brings peace, that is not a failure either. It is a sign that you have reached the threshold of a transitional stage. Part 3. When an empath withholds closure, what actually happens inside the narcissist? A very specific reaction occurs when an empath does not provide closure, and it is nothing like what outsiders usually imagine. There is no immediate emotional explosion, no overt panic, no loud collapse. What happens first is a disturbance that is very quiet, almost invisible, yet profoundly destabilizing from within. The narcissist does not immediately feel pain. They feel disoriented. It is not the loss of you, but the loss of coordinates. They can no longer locate themselves within the timeline of that relationship. The story does not close, which means they no longer know which part of the script they are in. Are they the one who was abandoned, the winner, the victim, the misunderstood one? There is no answer, and this absence creates a prolonged form of cognitive interference. At this stage, the narcissist is not thinking about you as a person. They are thinking about the final moment that never happened, a conclusion that should have existed but didn't. And it is precisely this temporal gap that begins to erode their already fragile sense of certainty. What is dangerous here is this. The panic does not register as panic. It shows up instead as hard-to-name states, unprovoked impatience, background irritability, a sense of being offended when no one has done anything, and a vague urge to do something just to end this suspended state. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the shadow is no longer neatly projected outward, but begins to seep back into consciousness. Yet it does not appear as a clearly defined darkness. It appears as anxiety without a cause, and the narcissist has no idea where to place it. When the empath withholds closure, the narcissist loses something essential, their familiar way of ending things. They cannot fully inhabit the role of the righteous one, nor can they fully inhabit the role of the victim. And without a role, they fall into a deeply uncomfortable state of limbo, a state they habitually avoid at all costs. At this point, a paradox becomes visible. The narcissist appears indifferent on the surface, yet internally their psychological activity intensifies. They think more, but go nowhere. They replay scenarios again and again, not to understand, but to locate a plausible ending, a sentence, an action, a final image that would allow them to put a period at the end of the story. But the empath no longer provides that period. This is where the silent panic begins to turn inward. No closure means the narcissist is forced to coexist with an incomplete narrative. This is uncomfortable for anyone, but for the narcissist it is more deeply threatening. It forces them to sit alone with an undefined sense of self. There is no one there to confirm who they are in this story. No one to help them decide which parts to remember and which to discard. And without external assistance in editing the memory, they begin to feel that memory itself is unreliable, not because you said anything, but because no one said anything at all. This leads to a very characteristic response. The narcissist begins searching for endings elsewhere. Not to love, not to bond, but to test whether they can still generate a familiar kind of ending. Yet, because the story with you remains unresolved, every new ending feels weak, incomplete. This is why many narcissists, after being denied closure, become restless, easily bored, irritable, and unable to focus, even while appearing fine on the outside. The panic does not erupt, it seeps. Most importantly, this panic is not directed at you in any overt way. It is directed inward, though they do not recognize it as such. And because they cannot tolerate this state for long, they will eventually try to recreate an ending by any means available, either by pulling you back in or by rewriting the story in a way that favors them. But no matter which path they choose, one thing has already occurred. When the empath withholds closure, the narcissist is forced, perhaps for the first time, to face a story whose ending they do not control. And for them, this is not merely the failure of a relationship. It is a direct collision with their own incompleteness. Part 4, From Silent Panic to Behavior. How the narcissist creates a false ending. When the state of silent disorientation lasts long enough, the narcissist can no longer remain still. Not because they miss you in an emotional sense, but because the suspended feeling of having no ending begins to disrupt their entire sense of orientation. An unfinished story leaves them unable to locate themselves within their own experience, and when position cannot be determined, action becomes necessary in order to give reality a familiar shape. The first action is usually very subtle, very reasonable, almost harmless. A neutral message, an emotionless question, a suggestion to talk things through clearly. On the surface, it looks like belated maturity, but at a deeper level, it is an attempt to reconstruct a closing moment, one in which they still exist, are still seen, and can still place a period in the familiar way. The content of the conversation matters less than its existence. As long as there is contact, the suspension temporarily dissolves. When there is no response, another shift begins to occur. The narcissist needs to assign meaning to the silence, because silence cannot remain neutral for long. It must be named. And because there is no new information, they begin to generate their own explanations. You are assigned a new role in the story, not to attack you, but to help them re-establish their own position within the ended relationship. Once the role is named, the story takes form, and the instability briefly settles. But these internal interpretations are rarely sufficient. They need to be reflected. So the story begins to be told outwardly, not publicly, not loudly, just enough to have a listener. Each retelling subtly reshapes the narrative, not out of deliberate deceit, but in search of a sense of completeness. When someone nods, when there is agreement, the false ending gains momentum. and for a short time, it can replace the real ending. If these methods still fail to produce a sense of completion, behavior becomes more overt, a gesture designed to provoke attention, an action that forces you to respond, not because they want reconciliation, but because your reaction can be used as the closing moment. Conflict, anger, even a firm rejection all carry equal value at this level, as long as they create a clear cut in the experience. The problem is that no false ending is sustainable, because it is not formed through your participation, but through the self-repair efforts of a system that has lost its orientation. When the temporary calm fades, the original suspension returns, and so the search for an ending repeats, sometimes after weeks, sometimes after months, sometimes after a period long enough for outsiders to believe that everything is truly over. This is why some narcissists return very late, with the same approach, the same tone, as if the relationship was never fully laid down. Not because they cannot let go of you, but because none of their previous efforts had enough force to close the experience in the way they are accustomed to. At a deeper level, what is happening is not an attempt to hold on, but an attempt to create an ending that is tolerable. And when every false ending fails, a truth begins to emerge, not loudly, not dramatically, but with clarity. You are no longer in the story in the way they need in order to complete themselves. Part 5. Irrelevance. When the narcissist realizes you are no longer in their story, there comes a point when every attempt to manufacture an ending loses its effect. Not because the narcissist has arrived at some deep realization, but because they begin to face a deeply uncomfortable truth. You are no longer an element capable of triggering any response. This is not strategic silence, not intentional distance. It is something entirely different, a state in which their presence no longer produces any inner movement in you. This moment does not arrive abruptly. It comes as a loss of momentum. The narcissist begins to notice that no matter how much they think about you, retell the story of you, or replay old scenarios in their mind, nothing comes back. No friction, no indirect reaction, no emotional aftershock. And it is precisely this nothing happens that confuses them the most. At a deeper level, irrelevance is not experienced as abandonment. It is experienced as being excluded from a system they had always assumed they belonged to. You no longer occupy the role of witness, responder, or regulator of their experience. And when no one is keeping the rhythm, the story loses the energy required to continue. What is crucial to understand is this: irrelevance does not trigger intense anger. It triggers an unnamed emptiness. There is no clear object to blame, no conflict to cling to, no script to perform. There is only a void in which all previous efforts become meaningless. And because there is no image to hold on to, the narcissist cannot perform irrelevance the way they once performed suffering or victory. This is why at this stage you may notice a strange shift. The narcissist mentions you less, yet does not truly forget. They do not return forcefully, but they do not close the door completely either. Not because they are processing things in a healthy way, but because there is no way to continue without exposing helplessness. Irrelevance offers them no role to stand in. From a Jungian perspective, this is the point at which the old structure no longer has the strength to sustain the illusion of centrality. Not because someone shattered it, but because the energy that once sustained it has withdrawn without leaving a gap that can be filled. And unlike conflict or separation, irrelevance does not create a climactic memory. There is no final scene. There is only the prolonged absence of meaning. For the empath, this often unfolds in parallel, but in the opposite direction. You do not defeat them. You do not need their acknowledgement. You no longer even care whether they understand or not. Not because you have risen above them, but because that story is no longer where your awareness resides. When attention withdraws, irrelevance forms naturally not as a decision, but as a consequence. The core point here is this: irrelevance is not punishment. It is not a tactic. It is the natural result of an inner shift. When you no longer participate, no longer respond, no longer wait for something to happen, the old system no longer has the conditions required to exist. And when a system loses the conditions for existence, it does not collapse loudly, it quietly dissolves. In the final part, we will close with what matters most. Irrelevance is not only something that happens to the narcissist, it is the new state of the empath, and why this is the most sustainable form of freedom, one that requires no ending to be declared. Part 6. When you no longer need an ending, you are already outside the story. There is a very quiet moment that only those who have gone far enough can recognize. It is not the moment you finally understand everything, not the moment you forgive, and not the moment the other person disappears from your life. It is the moment you realize that nothing else needs to happen. You are no longer waiting for a word, no longer hoping for an action, no longer wondering whether they will ever realize anything. The story does not close with a clear period, but you are no longer standing there searching for that period either. And that, precisely, is the real ending. Many people believe that freedom must come with a beautiful conclusion, a mature conversation, a complete apology, or a belated acknowledgement. But lived experience reveals a different truth. Freedom does not need to be validated. It arrives when you no longer place your awareness in the space that once made you unsafe. When you withhold closure, you are not taking anything away from anyone. You are simply withdrawing your participation. And when participation withdraws, the structures that once revolved around it lose their force on their own. No need to break anything. No need to confront. No need to prove. Just no longer being there in the old way. This may be difficult for someone who always needs a clear ending to accept. But for you, at this point, an ending is no longer the goal. Inner steadiness is what guides you now. You no longer need to understand more in order to feel at peace. You no longer need recognition in order to trust your own experience. And you no longer need anyone standing at the end of the story to declare that everything is over. Because you know it has already been over for a long time. Not at the moment of separation, not at the moment of silence, but at the moment you stopped asking the question. When the question dies, every strategy dies with it. Every attempt to pull you back falls into empty space, not because you are stronger, but because you are no longer in the same psychological space to be pulled from. And this is the most important thing to remember. Irrelevance is not a victory. It is a complete withdrawal from a system that no longer has a role in your inner life. No noise, no announcement, no witnesses required. Just a morning when you wake up. Continue living and realize that the old story is no longer following you. That is not an ending someone gives you. It is a state you step into on your own. And when you are there, closure is no longer necessary. Because you have been on the other side of it for a very long time already.